Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Dusk Till Dawn, the podcast of the Diverse Ability Network, hosted by myself, Ed Robinson. Now, today is a brilliant and super interesting episode focused around HIV, which I'm really looking forward to get into. The two fantastic guests we have on today are Ben Tomlinson-Men and James Lahiff. So firstly, guys, I'd like to say thanks so much for getting involved today. As many could see, this is quite a taboo topic to discuss, but this podcast thrives on discussing these taboo topics, so it's an absolute pleasure to have you both on. So firstly, for our listeners, it'd be great to understand both of your current roles at Centrica and your motivation for joining the business.
Oh, go ahead. Go for it, Ben.
Okay, no worries, thank you. So I am a product owner currently in NEP, looking after a challenger brand. And I joined the business back in 2019 on a grad scheme. I'm also currently co-chair of Spectrum, which is our LGBT network. And my motivations for joining the business, interested in energy, interested in the change to green, sustainable energy. And also was interested in getting involved in all the D&I stuff that Centrica has got going on. So yeah, that's kind of why I joined.
And my name is James Lahiff, and I joined the business in 2014 after I'd been in the UK for about 8 years. I had several friends working for British Gas at the time. They talked about how much they loved the job. I was looking to do something different than what I had moved into the country doing. And I've been working as a call center agent since. Doing side work as projects as well.
Sounds super. I bet the call center stuff can be quite touch and go sometimes because
it keeps you on your toes.
Yeah, I was going to say I didn't ask because I did a sort of the winter readiness stuff. I only took a few calls and even they were a bit intense. So I can't imagine doing it daily.
It's therapy. You're a therapist without getting the degree or having to do the schooling for it.
That's fantastic. No, super guys. Thank you. So I noticed, Ben, you mentioned you are the co-chair of Spectrum, and James, I understand that you are also part of the Spectrum network. So are you both representing Spectrum today?
Yes.
Yeah, we are. So James is one of Spectrum's new regional representatives. So he looks after our Leicester office. And obviously he's kindly agreed to come and share his experiences with us today. And as I mentioned, I'm co-chair of Spectrum along with Mark. And I'm here just as an ally and a support to those living with HIV and AIDS, and also to represent the wider Spectrum network as well.
That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you. And I think that leads very well into the topic of today being HIV. So I think it's best for us to kick off with sort of a broader view or overall view of what HIV actually is.
Well, I'll jump in with that. HIV is a non-recurring retrovirus that crossed the animal and human barrier at some point in time at the end of the late 19th century, but entering into the human bloodstream within the 20th century. It is a virus that triggers the body's autoimmune system to release large amounts of CD4, CD8, and CD12, where it continuously attacks itself. It is not a virus that you survive from if you catch it and it remains untreated. CD4 and CD8 are your T cells. So when you catch a virus, your body will release CD4, which is the most common of the T cells, to attack. It's like having minions. So if you were thinking about this in a cartoon way, it would be hundreds of millions of minions going out to fight a battle. And the reason being that the body does it is it floods this out into the system to annihilate as much that it can of any virus that enters the bloodstream. So it gives the body time to understand what's invading the body or inside the body so that it can release CD8 or CD12, which are more like fighter pilots and specially trained T cells that go out to eradicate viruses within the body or parasites.
I guess from a point of view before that, is it a virus that can be transmitted? Is it a virus that can be biologically inherited?
It's both of those things.
Okay.
So it can be transmitted if the person who has HIV has a high replication and it's transmitted with blood-on-blood contact. There is a low transmission rate with saliva, and bodily fluids. It's generally a blood-bound virus. It can be passed biologically from mother to child, and that would happen during the birthing process. It's not transmitted necessarily through the blood or the genes. It is through the fluids of the body.
I think that's a really good overview of HIV in itself. So I think now it would be a great idea to then go into your personal story with HIV, James, and how it sort of impacts your life on a day-to-day basis.
Excellent. So I was diagnosed in 1997. I'm a long-term survivor of HIV. I contracted HIV after having a very long medical illness. I'd had a parasitic infection that was really rare to catch in a large city. I had Giardia, which is found in water, and usually water contaminated by animal fecal matter. I contracted it from fruit that had been brought in from South America that I bought in a grocery store. And this was before, in the late 90s, before there became stringent controls on sanitation of food crossing the world and going to supermarkets. So it took about 6 months to diagnose it. During that time frame, we were still in the height in America of HIV/AIDS killing people, and huge transmissions and large amounts of numbers of people contracting it. So my doctors at the time, my GPs, my specialists, were unsure of what I had because they wouldn't have known to look for the parasite that I had. So they kept testing me for HIV. So in a very strange way, I was incredibly lucky that I was having blood tests done almost bi-weekly to try and get to the bottom of why my digestive system wasn't working, why I was starving to death, why my immune system was collapsing, why I was having liver problems. It turns out that I had been dating somebody at that point in time who was HIV positive and was of the mindset and belief that they would transmit it to as many people as humanly possible.
Wow.
And the only reason why I ended up contracting HIV in a very non-transmittable way, kissing, was because I had almost no T cells left in my body. I was just above 250. Anything below 200 is full-blown AIDS because it means that your body's immune system is utterly compromised. So I was struggling with an immune system that was overworked and exhausted from trying to fight a parasite. So around the same time that my parasite was discovered, I found an article in a magazine and said, I think this is what I've got. My GP thought I was absolutely crazy. We did the test in the office. Bingo, that was it. We did my blood test. Got a phone call 5 days later, you need to come into the office. And that's when I found out that I was HIV positive. So, and for me, it's an unusual situation. Not many people land in this position where you know who you got it from, when you contracted it. And for me, then the race was on to seek treatment, which in the 90s is nothing remotely like it is today. I had been part of a social organization in America called ACT UP, which was the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And the first thing that I knew not to do was just to jump on any drugs. And from the early 90s until the end of the 90s, I'd watched many, many people suffer under what was then the typical drug regime of a single drug or dual drugs. And they were all cancer drugs that were being used, AZT, which is still used in combination with other drugs in this day and age, but it was used in high doses. And I sought out a clinical trial. I started calling hospitals, I started calling universities, looking for anyone who was doing any type of HIV-related clinical trial. I found one at the University of Northwestern hospitals in Chicago, and they were part of a worldwide trial program that was going on with combined drug therapy, which was the first of its kind, which is what every person who's been diagnosed since 2000 goes on to, is a combined drug therapy. It uses two different bodies of drugs. One is a non-reverse transcriptase inhibitor. The other one is an inverse transcriptase inhibitor. This means that the virus is not allowed to replicate backwards genetically or forwards genetically. It creates a barrier to the body's cellular structure so that the virus can't penetrate. So Yeah, I've been HIV positive 23 and a half years. This will be my 24th year this year, July the 2nd at 10:15 a.m. The date is forever etched into my memory.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and it's great to know that you're just still in a healthy being, and it's absolutely fantastic to know.
Healthy is one thing. Living with HIV, like anybody with a disability, what I consider healthy and what other people consider healthy definitely have their own parameters. So
Yeah.
Being a long-term survivor with HIV, especially someone who has had immunodeficiency issues, it's created I live a very different type of life than most people with health concerns. So whilst outside I appear absolutely fine, I have the health and well-being of like a 70 or 80-year-old, sadly. One
Yeah.
of the side effects of the drugs is that I suffer from osteopenia and osteoporosis. I have issues around muscular tension. I also suffer from foggy thinking, which can be related to one of the 3 drugs that I'm on, causes a lot of cloudy thinking. So yeah, I'm healthy for me, but I try never to compare it to anyone else.
And that's completely understandable. And I just wanted to, I guess, go back to what you mentioned at the very start of that, when you sort of got the parasitic immune disease.
I contracted it from fruit that had been imported. Since fruit travels the world and has the most, mileage and footprint to it, no one really thought at that point in time. There started to become problems in America around 96, where fruit was coming into the country that had bugs and critters, and there was no kind of sanitation protocol at that point in time. It wasn't as hardcore as what it's become now. So I had plums in January of 1997 that had come into a grocery store, and it was completely out of season. They're absolutely fantastic. I bought about half a kilo of them and went through them. And it was within days of eating them that my stomach started not feeling well. And that's how I contracted the parasite that I had. So it was a parasite that inflamed my immune system, which ended up bringing it down to a level that made me susceptible to almost anything.
Yeah, so on a whole, the parasite sort of dropped the amount of T cells in your body, which then made you susceptible to, I guess, the transmission of HIV through a very sort of uncommon or very easy way for it.
Yeah, so a lot of people think that you can get HIV from kissing, hugging, touching toilet seats, and that's ever so rare. I mean, the conditions that it took, I'd had in 1992, and I had a boyfriend who was HIV positive, full-blown AIDS, and we were together for a year and a half before I buried him. And, no point in time did I contract it. We were incredibly careful. We followed all the guidelines around safety, and I had been continued to remain to getting tested on a regular basis, along with STIs, just constantly, because health is all that you really inherit in life. Everything else is a golden bonus, but health is that's the great prize. So, I took it really seriously, having watched and grown up and been a teenager at the advent of the AIDS crisis at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. It was the first pandemic of my life, whereas this pandemic that we're going through now, I'm like, well, there's a lot of recent history here that can tell us how to cope and deal with it. But AIDS was originally, when it started making worldwide news, it was going to be the thing that was going to kill us all. You could get it by touching a door handle, and it just wasn't true. So
It's quite interesting that you bring, I guess, like being involved in the initial stages and throughout the whole pandemic in the 90s with HIV, and it kind of brings forward the question, and once they knew you had HIV, what happened after that? Because I know you mentioned a few drug trials. I assume there wasn't sort of one set treatment like there perhaps is now for doctors to go straight towards. It was kind of a very, I guess, a confusing time for themselves as well as for everyone else.
The science was young, incredibly young. So by the time that I was diagnosed, there were only 2 drugs for treating HIV. And within a year of my converting to being HIV positive was when groups of scientists around the world had been working on various drugs and found a way of combining medications. So then that way you could take safer levels of medication as opposed to these really highly toxic cancer medications. So there wasn't a lot of option. I remember my GP saying to me, well, we'll start you on AZT, we'll do this dose at this amount of milligrams. And I was just like, from what I knew and I understood of the medical side of it, having been an AIDS activist for many years by that point in time, I just wasn't going to submit myself to it, mainly because I knew the toxicity of it and the backlash. So there was blindness, heart attack, stroke. It was a really debilitating medication on its own. It would leave you nauseous with diarrhea, unable to do things, and it just wasn't an easily tolerated drug. So I wanted to find out what other options and what else was going on in the world, because I also knew that I was in an interesting position of being a recent conversion. So I knew exactly the date of when it became active in my body. I knew exactly what my T-cell and viral loads were. And I knew I was in a position medically, from a medical science position, to be a good candidate for new treatments. So the drug treatment that I went into, which was a 3-drug combined therapy, which required me to take 196 pills a day for 3 years, and arrange a special eating schedule and sleeping schedule and a liquid intake schedule just to take the medications. Within 9 months, I had almost no detectable viral load, and I had regained almost over half of my immune system back. So I was up to 500 T cells. So I wasn't bordering on the line of having AIDS, because the brokering line for AIDS is a T cell count less than 200, which just means that your immune system is compromised.
How did you get through the trial with the 3 drugs being combined together? Because it seems almost as if, first of all, it's tough anyway, but second of all, I guess thinking to yourself, okay, it's kind of a trial, they're not sure if it's going to work. I'm not really sure what the outcomes are going to be. So how did you go through that for those 3 years and from start to finish?
I really knew that I didn't have a choice. I knew that my options were incredibly limited, and I knew that I was in the hot seat. So I did the one thing that I've always been really good at, and that was I wanted to read as much as I could. So I went to a local medical library at a university hospital in Chicago where I was living, and just asked for all the paperwork for the clinical studies that I could find that was related around HIV. And I sat down and I just started reading medical information. And once you get beyond the technical side of it, you begin to understand what the medical studies look like. And that's the information that's always core and key to any kind of medical condition. I think doctors are fantastic, specialists are great, but there's something about just pure information that allows you to coalesce everything together. And I decided that my best choices and options were going to be to take a radical approach. And I knew the size and volume of the clinical trial that I was entering. It was worldwide. So it was in 3 cities in America. It was in pretty much every major city in every major European country that had hospitals that dealt with gay men who were dying from AIDS, and gay women and immigrants, because it's, I want to really stress that it is an all people disease. So I also knew that I was in a different position, being someone who had just serial converted, that they'd be interested in taking me on, because most people at that point in time in the studies, I think I was one of only 2 people out of 10,000 that was serial positive conversion that joined this study. So there were only 2 of us. And I know there were eager eyes on it because we hadn't been exposed to any previous drug regimes. So there was less interaction in our bodies, and there was already less damage to have to consider, just the damage of what the virus was doing. but I kind of had to lock myself down. I had been sick for 6 months beforehand, pretty much starving to death because I couldn't eat. I was just so excited when they diagnosed that I was like, okay, anything else, I'll just deal with it. I had moments of real trauma, but I kind of didn't have time for them. I knew that this was the most important thing that I was going to do, was to be able to survive what I thought was just going to be 1 year trial, was just to survive it and to keep my body functioning as best as it could and not to succumb to the virus. So I was incredibly lucky that the clinical trial actually had a fabulous support team. So I had psychological support, which I needed just to deal with the psychological side of medical intervention. There was a lot of medical testing that went with it, lots of blood draws, up to pints at a time of blood being taken. And then there were nutritionists, which were really, really, really needed because I was in a really bad place physically. So it was just doing what I think a lot of people do when they're hit with any kind of major traumas. You just get your head down, and you either make the choice to get through it or to succumb by it. And having buried my boyfriend, watched multiples of friends die, I couldn't look myself in the mirror without fighting. I had a chance to fight, and there was no way I was going to let that go past me. It wasn't until well after I'd been out of the clinical study that the bricks came tumbling down, and I really had a chance to digest what had happened and what it means. And interestingly enough, right now in my life, I'm kind of reliving what it means to live long-term with HIV. Now I question my mortality now more than I did when I was diagnosed.
Thank you so much for sharing that story, because it's so powerful, of just surviving during that clinical trial when essentially your life is so much focused physically and mentally around that, and the 3 years that they've essentially told you. Ridiculously strong mindset has obviously carried you all the way out through the experiences that you've had pre to that. So thank you so much for sharing that. That's fantastic.
It's interesting because I think at some point in time when the 3-drug combined drug therapy became available in the market, it was hailed as not a cure, but it was going to save us all, meaning that anyone who was HIV positive. And interestingly, by 2001, you stop hearing about HIV as much. And if you look through news stories now, you find that there's almost rarely a mention of HIV. And while transmission rates are down amongst gay white men, transmission rates are up worldwide among heterosexual women and men and children. So it's something that, because a decent amount of medication has become available, and there's not been any larger breakthroughs, and it's only through COVID that drug therapies that were used for HIV have been used to create the vaccine to treat COVID. That now that science, the COVID science, is being used at looking at vaccinating HIV positive people. So HIV hasn't had a lot of attention, I'd say, in the last decade and a half, more than anything, because it's simmered down. It stopped being a crisis in the functional countries of the world, whereas it's still a crisis in third world countries. So we just don't talk about it as much. And I think what happens a lot of the time is recent history gets glossed over for the next big and bright thing. So it's not surprising when people don't understand or have a lot of understanding about HIV. It was traumatic when it happened in the 80s and in the 90s, especially for the LGBTQ community, and especially amongst women who were the least spoken of when it came to HIV. So you kind of want to put the horrors behind you. It's the same thing with COVID. People are like, I just want to get back to normal. I just want to get back to normal. And it's like, we've just all of it experienced a lot, and you can't forget it. You can't shelve it. You can't put it away. And you can't say things like there are many learnings to take away from it. No, there's not. This is life. These are the things that happen. Viruses come about. You have to have the conversation has to always be ripe. It's everyone's responsibility to understand what the role is on the planet. And you just can't turn a blind eye to these things.
Yeah, I definitely agree. But also another point which actually kind of leads into the next thing I wanted to go into that you briefly mentioned was transmission rates. You mentioned that they were down in gay men, but they're up across heterosexual men and women. And I think one of the most common misconceptions with HIV is the frequent link that people make between HIV and the LGBTQIA plus community. Why do you think this is?
Well, it comes back from the beginning of it being acknowledged worldwide when gay men started getting rare cancers like sarcoma or lymphoma. It was mainly seen amongst men. So it really became a gay man's disease. And for years, it was known as GRID or gay cancer up until about the early 80s, before it became HIV or AIDS. So it was first seen amongst gay men, overseen and missed in African continents where it had been in existence prior to being within the greater populace of the world, amongst sex workers who had been transmitting it. People didn't really pay attention, or the medical world didn't really pay attention to people who were not middle class and of a certain color or from a certain background. People just thought, these people are contracting sexually transmittable diseases, they're getting cancers. It took a while to put two and two together, and it wasn't until they started tracking gay men and who they'd started sleeping with, or who they'd been sleeping with, that they found how it was transmitting. So it's always been predominantly seen in Western culture as a gay white disease.
And I suppose once they sort of make that correlation, they've automatically gone to causation, haven't they? When in reality, correlation isn't always causation. And it's interesting how it just sticks around.
Exactly. And I'll say, having been part of an AIDS activist group, the things that we were really struggling for in the very early 90s was healthcare for women, healthcare for intravenous drug users. The street transmission rate was always higher than the transmission rate among sexual promiscuity. So, intravenous drugs users, before there were needle exchange programs, would just keep reusing the same needle over and over, and they'd share them with their friends, had a much higher rate of transmission. One of the things that has, and I feel hesitant to say it, but I think it's a blessing and a curse. There's prophylactic medication that you can take now if you're sexually active, and it is an HIV drug that you take. It's only one out of a sequence of drugs, or it's actually two drugs in a single tablet, but it's out of a sequence of a larger medication regime like I would be on, where if you're sexually active, you can take it, and it blocks the body from allowing HIV to replicate. So it acts as a vaccine to getting HIV. It's a prophylactic measure. And in many ways, for me, when that became a hint on the horizon, at first I thought, oh, this is the greatest thing ever. People can have sex without guilt, barring that there are other sexually transmittable diseases in the world, but, none that would kill you outright, unless you really, really, really allow them to go on and on. Unlike HIV, where you can get it and not know that you have it. And I thought, oh, this is fantastic. But it's been interesting over the last 15 years to watch people's ideas around this particular combined drug therapy as a prophylactic drug therapy means that there's even less conversation because there's a pill. And I know people in Leicestershire who are on it but know nothing about HIV. And it's like, why would you take any kind of evasive medication and not know the history of what's out in the world? People could really get caught up in day-to-day life without looking at the larger picture of things. Sex is a privilege, and it's something. It's the ultimate form of communication. You're physically communicating with someone else, a complex series of thoughts, expressions, passion, a chemical desire, and that comes at a cost, and that cost could be your life, it could be your well-being, and it could be from any number of an STI, with the ultimate STI being HIV. And HIV comes with a really heavy emotional price to pay. I haven't really touched on saying, that after I came off my clinical trial, about 3.5 years after I'd been through this clinical trial, I had a complete nervous breakdown from the weight and the strain, when I just realized, oh my God, I'm a vessel for something that might kill somebody. It becomes a great burden and a responsibility of how do I manage my health to make sure that not only am I taking care of myself, but I put no other human at risk, that I do no harm. And when it comes to sex, a lot of times people don't stop to think of, this is a beautiful thing. I want to enjoy it, but I don't want to create any harm. There's responsibility that comes with it. And it's an uncomfortable conversation to have.
That's the beauty of this podcast, right? I'm sure me and Ben are sat here sort of taking it all in, and it's honestly really interesting to listen to.
I mean, I am a member of the LGBT community, right? So, and I'm part of Spectrum. So you'd think that I would be sat here just knowing everything that James is saying, but even from my perspective, this has been so eye-opening. So just initially, thank you, James, for sharing all of this.
Oh, cool.
Absolutely.
But it's interesting from a differently abled perspective. I would not ever expect anybody to understand, my life or the path that I walk or what I do. And for me, the gift of that is it constantly reminds me, as a swift kick in the pants, especially when I'm not paying attention, that I can't begin to understand what everyone else has been through or what they go through. We wear a skin, which is our first, your skin is your first bit of clothing. Everything else is an accessory over it. And then your personality is the carrier that gets you through the day. So for decades now, I've always kind of kept myself on as long as I'm not at death's door, visibly at death's door, I'm just going to steamroll ahead, and I'm only going to say something if I absolutely need to. And it's taken me almost the entire time that I've lived in the UK to be able to be freer about saying, you know what, today's not a good day. My medication's really giving me problems. My manager and I'll have that conversation. I can just say my HIV meds are kicking me. I'm down today. I might need to take some extra breaks just so I can deal with side effects. Or, I might have problems with muscle cramping or joint pain, which are side effects of my long-term exposure to the medication. Because of the meds I was on very early on were nowhere near as smooth and as easier to tolerate as the medications are today. I have effects from those very early medications from the clinical trial. So I'm learning, and I'm learning to learn. And just because I'm part of the LGBTQ community, or I'm an HIV positive person, or disabled, it's only my story that I know, and that it's my responsibility to understand other people's stories. So it's really great to be able to be asked and to have really good questions come my way, because it gives me a chance to think about my own life in a way that sometimes I forget to stop and reflect on. So doing this has been a pleasure today. The other thing I have to say is a lot of what got me through the first 3 years of being HIV positive, before there was the term ally, it was just strangers. People who knew that I was having problems with my health. People would just stop and do the kindest, most unconscionably wonderful things out of nowhere. Someone once wrote a check and submitted it to my landlord and paid for 3 months of my rent because they knew that I wasn't going to be able to work. Someone who I only knew on a social level, no more than a hey, how you doing, occasional cup of coffee, weren't very close. So people have been incredibly kind and generous. And when you're faced with something that is big in your life, it's great when people step forward in an unconscious way to share compassion and support. The number of times that friends would just drop over unannounced just to hang out because they hadn't heard from me from a little bit, or they had heard that I might have been under the weather. It was just phenomenal, and that floated me through that, and keeping my head down and just pushing. But it was those shoulders, those hugs, those moments of stupid laughter that meant and are my most cherished memories out of really what was an incredibly dark time of trying to manage my family's expectation of my impending death. Everybody thinking that, how long is he going to live? It was all the people that weren't necessarily intrinsic to my life that got me through. So I always try to, as much as I can, to think, yeah, you're having a bad day, but in my head I have to go, no, but they are having a bad day. You know what that's like. You understand that. It's just to try and turn the ego off for a moment or two to understand where someone else is coming from, because you may look fine, you may not look fine, but you feel fine. So it's you never know what undercurrent is happening in someone's life, and how important the few words you can say or the action you can do will mean, and how that'll be carried. And yeah, that has been the thing that got me through till I was safe enough to have a nervous breakdown, then deal with all the emotional baggage that I hadn't dealt with.
Completely agree, and it sounds absolutely lovely, them sort of random acts of kindness. And I think one of the key things that I did want to ask is perhaps the other side of that, where there's a bit of a misconception between HIV and the LGBTQIA plus community. Stigma can sometimes and often is attached to that misconception. As an individual with HIV, have you ever witnessed this firsthand? Or Ben, have you ever witnessed or seen this firsthand as well?
I don't mind going first because I don't have much to say on it, actually, because thankfully I can say that I haven't ever witnessed anyone, be impacted negatively by the stigma. But I appreciate I've had quite a sheltered upbringing in this sense, and I've probably never been, never been in a situation to witness it. But I'm very glad to say that I personally haven't. But I don't know, James, your story might be slightly different.
There's always a certain amount of stigma around it, and I think the stigma that I often get is around how I appear. So people often misconstrue that because I look healthy, that I am healthy. I have got underlying health concerns that I've been dealing with for the last 15 years. So I don't look like there's anything wrong. And if I were to say, oh, I've got HIV related problems. Oh yeah, but you're on you take the medication. It's like, yeah, sorry, that's not how it works. It's yeah, I take some tablets that, cause a great deal of havoc within my body to a certain degree. And I'm now something like 30% more likely to have cancer at this point in my life because I've lived with HIV for longer than 16 years. So whereas, all the hard work is going in underneath the skin. So there are times that you won't see it. For myself, I've got issues around my skeletal system where I can have really incredibly off days. So there is stigma around people not understanding that because somebody looks fine, that there could be something wrong, or there could be health concerns. And I've had a certain amount in office, actually, when I first started with British Gas, people on my team there were very uncomfortable conversations about not wanting to even share a desk bay. And that came down to a cultural understanding and this in misconstruction of ideas and misconstruing what HIV is. So it's very, very subtle, I think. 20 years ago, there was definitely bigger issues around it where, like my dating life was non-existent. I can only date people who are HIV positive because if they weren't HIV positive, there's no way they would go out with somebody who was. So there's always been a certain amount of stigma of it, but I think anybody who's differently abled experiences their own version of that in some way, and it's a quiet way. It's not always blaringly obvious like television shows, movies, and Instagram posts want us to believe. Those are the rare exceptions, but there is bias in a day-to-day. But I will say it's definitely in my life. It's definitely better now than it was when I was in my early 20s. So
one of the questions I just wanted to ask off the back of that was, especially when you've had that sort of bias in with your central colleagues or members in your team, was there any sort of steps you took in trying to eliminate that bias, whether that was just sort of knowledge sharing or just pulling them for a chat or something like that? Was there anything that was sort of...
Well, because British Gas has always been inclusive since I've been with British Gas, there was just no tolerance of it. So there were some hard conversations that were had, but one of the choices I had was to be involved with those conversations. So I firmly believe that people have more in common than they don't. So regardless of your skin color, your religious beliefs, your gender identity, or anything that you construct yourself to be, we have more in common than we don't. So I've always made it a point to be part of the conversation and to make it a conversation, as opposed to, do you understand why you're being offensive to somebody? It's more like, hey, maybe you don't understand how this works. I can't give you HIV. I can't give you gay. So I'm not going to infect you with my gay or my HIV status. My life is just a little bit different than yours, but I think there are things about you that I don't understand. And that could be seen as being offensive to you when I'm speaking to you, in the same way that you're being offensive to me without realizing you're being offensive to me. I had a brilliant business manager who really was all about being inclusive and understanding and caring and compassionate. And she really smoothed the pathway for what was a really rocky first 6 weeks in the business. So, but I think that's the only way you can progress in life, is you've got to understand that we probably have more in common than we don't. And the things that we don't agree on, that's absolutely fine. We don't have to agree on it.
No, definitely. It's great that they wanted to get you involved in those conversations as well. I feel like that's always really important.
Well, to be honest, they didn't want to get me involved with them. I kind of weaseled my way into them by saying I wanted to be involved because I thought it was important that, especially because it was me and a couple of people, it was really important that it was goodwill and it's not about admonishing anybody. Because you don't know what you don't know until someone tells you you don't know this. One of the worst idioms in the world, but it is the truth. So, and it works both ways. So it was good because I got to understand some people that we never were friends, but we worked well together, and we just kind of made it. Well, this is our work family. This is how we work together. We're like brothers who don't get along. That's fine, but we both do good work. That's cool. We can recognize it. Great. We don't have to hang out. Fantastic, and it worked.
So for people who may be going through similar scenarios with HIV and perhaps want to look at other sources for support or guidance, whether they're they're at the start of their journey with HIV or just going through it as we speak now, is there any that you'd recommend?
Yeah. So right off the bat, you'll get a GU specialist if you're in the UK, and that is the person that will be your guide and your guardian, and they will take care of you physically and look out for you. The resources that mean a lot to me are more recent in my life. So World AIDS Day has a website at worldaidsday.org, which has fantastic information. UNAIDS, which is UNAIDS, which it dispenses information and resources. And my favorite of them, which is something that was born out of a site that I used in America that has continued to grow, is called National AIDS Map, which is brilliant. It is anything and everything. Whether you want to know and understand the science, you have obscure questions, someone has asked it before, and they post the information. And then the Terrence Higgins Trust and the Elton Johns Foundation are both fantastic, but there are also local resources. Almost every town and city in the UK has some resource on a social level for HIV because it's very well funded by the government. But definitely starting with your specialist, and they can point you to local things. But if you want something national or just an understanding, the websites that I've mentioned are fantastic.
Thank you both for sharing your knowledge, and like me and Ben say, James, your personal experience has been absolutely invaluable today. So thank you so much. It's been great listening in, and especially because we've busted a few misconceptions along the way as well. But to reiterate what I said at the start, this podcast thrives on discussing what others may see as taboo topics. So, yet again, thank you very much for coming on, and thank you so much for our listeners.